Welcome to this lecture on democratic ethic, values, and principles. In this lecture, we will explore the nature of a democratic ethic, a dimension of a democratic ethic in terms of its fundamental basic values and principles. Democracy is more than a system of government. Democracy is more fundamentally a political ethic. In fact, a democratic system of government is based in and founded upon a political ethic, a democratic ethic. And that democratic ethic has certain fundamental commonly shared values and principles. These values and principles in turn provide the content for public reason and public deliberation fundamental to democracy, as we will see in the next lecture. In this lecture, we seek to understand the meaning of the basic values and principles of a democratic ethic. To begin, democracy is premised upon the logic of equality. That is, the basic premise of a democratic ethic, and in turn a democratic system of government, is the moral claim of equality. From equality, as we'll see, other values, such as liberty, are derived. And in turn, fundamental principles of democracy find their source in the idea, the value of equality. Now, equality is a complex notion with at least four types of equality, four fundamental types of equality: intrinsic or moral equality, political equality, legal equality, and equality of opportunity or social equality. Let's begin with intrinsic equality. Intrinsic equality is the fundamental premise. And this is the idea, or rather the moral claim, that each human being, and therefore each citizen, possesses an equal inherent value and dignity, an equal inherent worth. And that suggests that the good of every human being is inherently equal to that of any other. This is a freestanding moral claim, normative claim, in that it does not assume any kind of metaphysical or religious grounding, such as the sacredness of the individual, although it is compatible with those ideas. But it is not contingent upon any particular comprehensive doctrine. It is a political and moral claim, a politically moral claim, that each individual has equal inherent worth. This idea is relatively new in human history. For most of human history, there was a fundamental belief, assumption, premise that human beings were inherently, intrinsically unequal. The nobility, for example, was thought to be inherently superior to the peasantry. Certain races have been thought to be inherently superior to other inferior races. Women generally were thought to be inferior to men. All of that is rejected and reversed by the assumption of moral and intrinsic equality. And that is a long and painful history. However, it is our current assumption, and I believe a fundamentally important one. Each individual should be considered and treated as possessing an equal inherent worth. And that means that each person, every person, possesses an equal claim to all fundamental social goods, including liberty. This guarantees, or should guarantee, uh, the right to equal participation in the society. And that leads us to the second kind of equality, which is political equality. Political equality is the principle of equal consideration of goods and interests of every person who is deemed equal, that means every person, in the process of decision making, and the consideration of all adult members as equally qualified to participate in the decision-making process. So political equality is the claim that based upon intrinsic equality, each person has a fundamental right to have their interests taken into consideration in the political process and to equally participate in that process. And this is the bedrock principle of a democratic system of government. It leads to deliberative democracy and a representative democracy. Now, political equality doesn't mean that each person's interests be directly considered, or that each person directly participates in the political process. Representation is a legitimate vehicle or means for equal consideration and equal participation. So what follows from a political equality are two fundamental principles of equal consideration, the principle of equal consideration and the principle of equal participation. The third kind of equality is legal equality, which is embodied in our Constitution by the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law. No state shall deny to a person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Legal equality guarantees that the legal system, the legal process, be equal, that it treat each citizen as an equal, not giving any privilege or special interest to any individual. It also suggests that no individual is above the law, that every person is subject to the law, including the highest political officers. Legal equality under equal protection also guarantees a right to due process. The fourth kind of equality, social equality, is equality of opportunity. And this means that social offices and rewards should be distributed on the grounds of opportunities open to all on an equal basis. Equal opportunity means that no one should be barred from the opportunity to participate in the society and to participate in any of its offices, or be denied any of its rewards if merited. In fact, equality of opportunity is the basis of a meritocratic system of social distribution. Now, equality of opportunity is a contested idea. There are four possible readings among many, or definitions of equality of opportunity. The first is formal equality of opportunity, and that's defined as the absence of legal or quasi-legal barriers to participation and or achievement within public institutions. For example, racial segregation violates formal equality of opportunity, and such segregation was struck down as unconstitutional in the famous Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. Formal equality of opportunity guarantees equal access to institutions, and that's all it does. It doesn't speak to the quality of those institutions, nor does it speak to the capability of individuals to access and benefit from institutions. Formal equality only guarantees equal access to institutions in that there are no barriers, legal, quasi-legal barriers, to accessing those institutions. Fair means regarding equality includes formal equality, but transcends formal equality to include equity in terms of means and resources. Fair equality of opportunity is the idea that of the fair value of access to institutions. That is, fair means regarding equality of opportunity suggests that individuals have the capability, on the one hand, the capability to access institutions on a fair basis, and secondly, that those institutions are roughly equitable in their quality. Equal opportunity as maximization suggests or is defined as maximizing the life chances of each individual. And the fourth notion of equality of opportunity, adequate equality of opportunity or adequacy, suggests that equal opportunity is available only when the means are available necessary to meet publicly set standards of achievement. That is, if the government sets a standard, an achievement standard in education, for example, then adequate equal opportunity demands that each individual student receive the necessary means to the achievement of that standard. And if the means are not available or provided to the student, then equal opportunity is not fulfilled. So we have a complex notion of equality. It involves intrinsic equality, political equality, legal equality, and social equality. And there are very good reasons for adopting the principle of intrinsic equality and what follows from it, political, legal, and social equality. The alternative to intrinsic equality, of course, is the adoption of intrinsic superiority and inferiority. This would lead to a principle of unequal consideration. It would lead to a principle, the Platonic ideal of unequal qualifications to participate. That is, only the best and the brightest would be able to vote or participate in the political process. We would reject it on the grounds of prudence. This would intrinsic inequality is not appealing because it it results in a elite group controlling the society and the vast majority being an underprivileged group, at least in terms of politics and political participation. The intrinsic equality, therefore, it seems to be the most appealing assumption, an assumption that we as a society commonly agree to and share. To make a claim more of intrinsic inequality is, in our political culture, not acceptable. What follows are necessary criteria for political equality to be actualized. For political equality to be real, there has to be effective participation. There have to be equal and effective opportunities for articulating one's opinions and interests. There has to be equal voting, one person, one vote. There has to be enlightened understanding among the citizenry, and we'll talk more about this as we proceed. There have to be equal and effective opportunities for learning about the political system and policy alternatives. That is, citizens must have the knowledge and skill to participate in the political process. They must have enlightened understanding. For political equality to occur, to be real, there has to be participation in agenda setting. There have to be opportunities to decide how and what is placed on the political agenda. There has to be inclusion. All adults, based upon equality, have standing in the moral and political community. That is, all adult citizens are legitimate participants in the political process and in the life of the society. Standing is a legal notion. One who has standing is in a position to make valid claims before a court. Only those who have standing are entitled to make claims in a court. The same idea here is that only citizens have standing in a political community and can participate in that community. Thereby, equal citizens, free and equal citizens, have standing. These criteria serve as standards for deciding and evaluating democratic institutions, including educational institutions. Do our institutions provide these opportunities? Do they fulfill these criteria of political equality? We now turn to liberty, which is the second fundamental value of a democratic ethic. Liberty follows from equality. If we're morally equal, if we're politically equal, etc., then there is no higher authority above us. There is no superior above us that would decide our life plan, decide our interests, decide our good, decide our life plan. Only there are, of course, authorities in a democracy, and as we'll discuss later, that authority is only legitimate if it's based upon consent of the governed. This suggests a fundamental value of liberty follows from equality. What is liberty? Liberty has to do, first of all, with choice. The freedom to choose is a basic requirement of intrinsic equality. We as human beings have the capacity, based in our practical reason, to choose, to formulate life plans, to formulate and decide upon our interests and what is good for us as individuals. We have the capacity also to conceive of the means to the fulfillment of our interests. the fulfillment of our ends. So liberty is the freedom to choose. As an individual, we could call this personal liberty, to choose to define and pursue one's own conception of the good. This idea of personal choice as freedom is connected to what political philosophers call negative liberty. And negative liberty is defined as the freedom from coercive interference, creating a zone of individual privacy and personal freedom. Negative liberty guarantees the freedom to define and pursue one's own conception of the good life consistent with the freedom of others. That is, negative liberty tells us that we are free to pursue our own choices of the good life, our own personal choices about how to live, what we value, etc., free from the interference of the government, free from the interference of other citizens. As long as our freedom is consistent, our choices are consistent with the freedom of others. That is, negative liberty does not suggest we're free to do anything. We're not free to enslave another. We're not free to steal from another, because those two activities violate the freedom of others. So our negative freedom, our negative liberty, is not a free-for-all. It's a freedom checked by the freedom of others. But it does guarantee a very important zone of individual privacy and personal freedom. In a democratic system, we have a right to negative liberty. Positive liberty, based in political equality. It's the freedom to participate, on the one hand, to participate in society in a positive sense, where negative liberty is freedom from, positive liberty is freedom to. Freedom to participate on the one hand, and freedom to develop our inherent abilities, talents, powers, capabilities. So positive freedom is the idea of self-determination, based in political equality. It's also the idea of developmental liberty. Positive liberty is a facet of positive liberty can be understood as developmental liberty. That is, we possess a fundamental right to our own powers as individuals. That's given to us by intrinsic equality, that we have a right to our own powers and talents, and therefore we have a right to develop and utilize them. This leads to also the idea of counter-extractive liberty, that individuals are justified in demanding protection from the exploitive extraction of their powers, and the state has a duty to protect them from exploitation, the exploitive extraction of their powers. So liberty includes the freedom to develop and to exercise our talents, and to be free from the exploitive extraction of our powers of others. As we can see, liberty is a rich and complex notion, much talked about, much debated. But this freedom, personal freedom, negative liberty, positive liberty as self-determination, political self-determination, and as developmental liberty capture the many faceted nature of human freedom. It's an incomplete notion, but it's a rich idea. There is always the question of the relationship between democracy and capitalism. Capitalism can tend to, um, some argue, that capitalism is based upon the extraction of the powers and capabilities of individual workers. Um, Therefore, capitalism based upon run unregulated would lead to profound inequality and a loss of liberty. On the other hand, capitalism fairly regulated uh, is, as history bears out, is compatible with democracy. Of course, this is a very complex and controversial area of inquiry. Um, it suggests, bringing it up here suggests that democracy, um, perhaps a democratic ethic can perhaps be in tension with certain other institutions in our society that may operate in an undemocratic way. Um, and the question then becomes, should all institutions, including economic institutions, comport with the values and principles of democracy? We will bring this up again when we discuss the prominent philosophy of education, human capital theory, which is a theory of education firmly grounded in the imperatives of capitalism, and we'll have to ask whether human capital theory is consistent with the values and principles of a democracy. We now turn to the fundamental principles of a democratic ethic, and these principles follow from the basic values of a democracy: equality and liberty. Democracy can be conceived, perhaps should be conceived, as a system of rights. And principles, rights pertain to principles. Rights can be defined as as a legitimate claim, a valid legitimate claim to the actual enjoyment of particular social goods guaranteed by the society. So rights are claims. Rights are also fundamental protections. That is, to have a right is to be protected against exploitation, oppression, coercion, etc. Rights protect the weak from the strong and guarantee a life of equality, dignity, and freedom. Rights are expression, our way of expressing full standing and membership in a democratic society. So, what follows from equality, the value of equality, and the value of liberty are certain basic rights which guarantee the enjoyment of equality and the enjoyment of liberty in all of its dimensions. Rights entail duties, correlative duties. That is, rights and duties are inseparable. If one has a right, one also has a duty. They are flip sides of the same coin. And correlative duties refer to duties to aid, to protect, and to avoid depriving the people of their rights. So their duties are positive and negative. They involved aiding, positive action to aid, positive action to protect, also negative restraint to avoid depriving citizens of their rights. These duties, obligations to protect, aid, and avoid are fundamental to rights of liberty, to the actual enjoyment of liberty. And they are founded upon two fundamental principles: non-repression. Principles of non-repression and non-discrimination limit democratic authority. That is, they're the outer limit of protection of democratic majorities. That is, whatever the majority decides, even if a majority decides in its policies to exploit or deny the rights of a minority through repression and discrimination, then those policies and laws can be struck down as illegitimate and invalid. And those limits center around the ideas of non-repression and non-discrimination. They are intrinsic to a democracy, necessary for rational deliberation. They're necessary for the protection of basic rights. They're necessary for the protection of equality, in particular political equality, equal consideration, and participation. This is the case because repressing ideas, beliefs, values, etc., stifles rational, critical deliberation in the society. As we'll see, deliberation in a democratic society must be free, must be open and free, and repression stifles that freedom. Censorship, banning of ideas is a contradiction to equality and liberty. Therefore, non-repression is fundamental to a democratic society, a basic principle. Policies must comport with the parameters of non-repression. That includes freedom of speech, academic freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, etc. A lack of those freedoms stifles participation and deliberation. Secondly, discrimination, unfair discrimination excludes individuals from full and equal participation, thereby repressing the capacity and desire to participate in the society. Discrimination also denies equal opportunity to individuals in its fundamental sense of equal access, but also discrimination violates adequacy and it violates fair equality of opportunity. In the face of discrimination, individuals do not have the fair value of their rights, do not have the fair value of their liberty. This suggests what follows from non-discrimination and non-repression is the principle of neutrality. There's a government obligation to neither promote nor repress any conception of the good life and to make differential policy based upon race and ethnicity without a compelling state reason or state interest. That is, the government, from this point of view, the principle of neutrality, must remain neutral to the status of individuals and neutral to their choices about the conception of the good life. It can neither promote nor repress religion, promote or repress a particular philosophical orientation, etc. And neutrality is the essence. Non-repression, non-discrimination, neutrality are the essence of tolerance toleration, fundamental to liberty, and also respect. It embodies respect or actualizes respect for persons. We respect free and equal citizens. We respect each other as free and equal citizens by adhering to the principles of non-repression and non-discrimination. The Brown, as already noted, the Brown decision found that exclusionary racial classifications violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and therefore was unconstitutional. That is, legal racial segregation, de jure racial segregation, violated citizens' moral, political, social, and legal equality, thereby constituting an injustice. Another way to put this is that racial segregation, as an example, violated the principle of non-discrimination. It violated the principle of neutrality. This suggests that the principle of non-discrimination and neutrality have been interpreted in terms of a colorblind constitutional theory. That the argument is it's prevalent that the Constitution, its values and principles, was framed as in terms of neutrality, as framed as neutral towards race, gender, ethnicity, religion, etc. Of course, we know that the original Constitution was not neutral towards race. It was race conscious and enshrined slavery as a legitimate practice. Of course, this was contested in the Civil War, led to a Civil War, the contest, and to the rewriting or the amendment of the Constitution, primarily in terms of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Central to the 14th Amendment was the Equal Protection Clause, and the historical argument has been that the Equal Protection Clause was intended to be race neutral. James Anderson, in his article that you've read, argues, I think very forcefully, that the intention, that claim of race neutrality and color blindness in the Constitution is historically inaccurate. That the framers of the 14th Amendment were in fact race conscious, not neutral, and their race consciousness shaped the language of the Equal Protection Clause in such a way that allowed for exclusionary racial policy in the future, leading to Anderson argues that the Equal Protection Clause, as interpreted by the framers of the 14th Amendment, was the basis of the Jim Crow era. In three fundamental legislative actions, the Naturalization Act of 1870, the Civil Rights Act of 75, and the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction Congress applied a race-conscious theory of constitutionalism. Their intent was to utilize race classifications to both exclude and include certain racial groups from citizenship. They did this by rejecting the idea put forth by liberal Republicans in the Congress at the time that one of the first formulations of the 14th Amendment included no distinctions of race and color, that specific language, and that would have embodied the principle of neutrality in the 14th Amendment. That language of neutrality was in fact rejected by a moderate conservative Republican majority, which inserted an equal protection language. The use of equal protection instead of no distinctions of race and color avoided any principle that would forbid racial discrimination and gave the states freedom to impose exclusionary and hence malignant racial classifications. This discussion suggests that neutrality may be, although a bedrock principle, grounded in non-discrimination, is not so strict as to disallow responses, governmental responses to past discrimination, racial discrimination, and other forms of discrimination. That remedies to the violation of non-discrimination can involve I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Apologies. The idea is that neutrality in response to violations of non-discrimination can employ preferential treatment to groups of individuals who have been unfairly discriminated against, unfairly repressed in the society. And that's the fundamental argument that Anderson is trying to make. It's consistent. In fact, one could argue that it is consistent with the spirit of non-repression and non-discrimination. In summary, we have explored two fundamental values of the democratic ethic: equality and liberty, and also have explored some basic principles of a democratic ethic consistent with the values of equality and liberty. Those principles are the idea of rights, the idea of correlated duties to those rights, the ideas of, or the principles of non-repression, non-discrimination, neutrality, and tolerance, as well as respect for persons. These values and principles are, in their broad outline, I believe, are commonly shared in our political culture, and therefore, as we'll see in the next lecture, may provide a powerful set of reasons for publicly justifying our policies, educational policies including, and as we will develop in the course, powerful reasons for the adoption of a particular philosophy of education. We, in the next lecture, turn to the idea of public reason and public deliberation based upon these values and principles.